Verse 19 is what we are ready for. If you've been following along with us, then you will know that we have just got through chapter 18, or at least half of it, to verse 18 as we've been going through the book of John. And we left off, right, after this long 5 chapters of being in the upper room and the Passover meal, and Jesus is sharing all of these things. It wasn't just a meal. All right, Jesus gave all these charge to his disciples, his final kind of talk with them, and then he's being betrayed. And so last week we kind of stopped right in the middle of there. He was just arrested. Peter had just cut off Malchus's ear, and Jesus healed it. And then Judas obviously betrayed him, and then now Jesus is in front of one of the high priests. Okay, so he's in front of Caiaphas. Caiaphas actually wasn't the high priest. Annas was the high priest, but Annas was actually the son-in-law of Caiaphas. Caiaphas put him in charge because he used to be the high priest. So it's kind of one of those things where Annas bears the title of high priest. So you'll see it through the Gospels that Annas was the high priest. And sometimes you see it that Caiaphas was the high priest during Jesus' crucifixion. And it's kind of both are true. Caiaphas previously was the high priest, but he didn't carry the title, but he carried the power, right? He carried the stick. Annas was the actual high priest, but since he was the measly old son-in-law and was put in there, right, by Caiaphas, his father-in-law, he was kind of like, Dad, is this okay? Kind of mentality, right? So if you're reading through the Gospels and you see that, don't be confused. Hopefully you can understand that. So that's where we are. Verse 19, let's dive in. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always meet. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me and what I've said to them. Indeed, they know what I have said. So the high priest starts asking Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine, right? So basically, the high priest is asking, I want to know who your cohorts are so we can arrest them as well. And I basically want you to incriminate yourself by saying, hey, we're teaching these false things. Right? There was no trial, as we're getting ready to talk about here in a second. There was no, bring the witnesses, which is what should have happened, right? It was basically, hey, Jesus, say something to incriminate yourself and say something about the disciples who are following you and teaching this other blasphemous stuff. That way, when we present you before Caesar here in a few minutes, before Pontius Pilate, before Rome, when we present you, we actually have something to say because hey, he just said this. We just interviewed him, and he incriminated himself against our law and against your law. So here you go, Pontius Pilate, kill him. Right? That's basically what they're trying to get Jesus to do. And Jesus said, hey, listen, I spoke openly. I taught in the synagogues. This wasn't like I held secret meetings. And when he talks about I said nothing in secret, that doesn't mean that, he didn't ever talk privately. We just got done reading 5 chapters, all right, where he did talk privately. But it wasn't purposely secret. It wasn't something that if someone wanted to come in and hear, oh, no, hey, sorry, you can't hear these elite spiritual words and this plan that we have to overthrow the Roman government or to take over, the religious leaders and overthrow the Pharisees and all this kind of stuff, right? That's what he's saying when I wasn't talking in secret. And so he spoke openly, so he's saying, listen, if you have a problem, go ask everyone else. Actually, ask yourselves. I've seen you in the crowd at a few synagogue meetings. I saw you on the temple. Remember when I turned over that table, kind of hit you in the face a little bit, didn't I? Right? He's like, you guys knew and heard what I said. So Jesus knew, obviously, because he was God, and he also, I think, knew because he was a smart man that, hey, they're trying to get him to incriminate himself and give some kind of material that they could have on him because they had nothing. The other Gospels, we see that they actually had to lie and make something up. John doesn't cover that, but we see that in the other Gospels. So Jesus did not live and talk in secret, and so neither should we, right? You can't be a secret follower of Jesus. You can't say, well, hey, I love Jesus and I love all of his teachings, but then your life looks nothing like Jesus's. It's called hypocrisy, and we're going to see that actually through this chapter. You're going to see the hypocrisy of Peter. You're going to see the hypocrisy of the high priest and also of the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees that are there in the midst of these kind of trials that they're having with Jesus. It's like we cannot say one thing and do another. That is hypocrisy. Matthew chapter 15, verses 7 through 9 says this. It says, you hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, The people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So what is he saying? He's saying, hey, listen, like these Pharisees and Sadducees that Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 15, he's saying, listen, you say all the right thing, but your heart is actually far from me. You're more concerned about all of these things, rules that you guys have made up, and trying to teach them as what I have said or as what God has said, when actually it's just what you have said, and you're trying to gain something. And later on, we'll talk about this where, again, he says something similar. He says, hey, you whitewashed tombs, right? You're full of dead man's bones. The outside of the cup is clean, but the inside is dirty. Like, you look nice on the outside. You got all these scriptures memorized. You're wearing the Christian t-shirt. You got Philippians, 3:14 tattooed on the side of your arm. You got a cross necklace. On the outside, you look good. On the inside, he's saying you're full of dead man's bones. And that's exactly what a hypocrite is. And I pray that neither one of us or none of us are in that place where we try to dress the part, but we actually miss what's going on in the heart. That's way more important. Way more important. You remember when the tax collector came before the Lord praying and was like, oh, I'm a wicked, wretched sinner, please, kind of forgive me. And then you have the other Pharisee, kind of rich man like, Lord, I'm just glad I'm not like that person. I'm glad I'm not like them. And Jesus is like, hey, which one had the more heartfelt prayer? I'm paraphrasing this. And he's like, oh, it's the tax collector. Because his heart was pure before me. Even though he was the sinner, even though maybe from the outside he looked and was worse. But the actual religious person who said all the right things but did all of the opposite, the Lord said, no, like go from me. I don't know you. And guys, I'll tell you from own personal experience, that's what convicted me. When I was 18 years old and I grew up in a Christian home, and some of you know my testimony, but that's the one thing I remember. I came to the church on that Sunday, and I went every Sunday and was part of the youth group, but living this life of partying and blah, 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 all this stuff. And I just remember just being miserable for one thing, because I was searching in all these areas to try to find some kind of everlasting peace or something that just made me happy all the time, and I was always left empty, whether it was drinking or whether it was girls or whether it was sports. Those are the three big things for me at the time, that I was always left me empty. Always, right? And I remember sitting there on that Sunday, and the pastor was preaching on hypocrisy. And maybe he said this a million times before. I don't know, right? But it was just one of those times where, have you ever felt like, for me as your pastor, like, hey, did he know what I did this week? He's actually talking about it. Like, he must be following me on Facebook. What did I put on my Facebook, And like the Lord was just speaking right to me. That's before Facebook, even MySpace, before cell phones. You guys believe that? Before cell phones. And I was sitting there, and he's preaching about hypocrisy, and I was like, that's me. That is absolutely me, saying one thing and doing another. Reading this verse, I'm like, that is me. Oh, man, and so I went forward afterwards, and they have a time of prayer, and I rededicated my life to the Lord. And at that point, something changed. I wouldn't say I was perfect by any means, but there was a true growth and a true seeking of God. Lord, I want to give you my whole heart. I want to be all in for you. And over time, things changed. My friends changed. My attitude as I got into the Word, and I started understanding that it was a relationship with Jesus and not this religious duty of coming on Sunday or a Wednesday youth group and saying the right part and just trying not to do these really bad sins, but looking the part. And it changed forever. And so we will see the hypocrisy here, but we see that Jesus had none of that. He taught openly. He lived openly. Hey, why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me. They know what I've said. One commentator puts it this way, and when he's talking about these, there was no formal charges against Jesus, right? So they're fishing for something. It says it was the high priest's duty to call forth the witness first, beginning with those for the defense. The basic legal protections of the Jewish system for the accursed were not observed in the trial of Jesus. Jesus therefore claimed that if his teaching was in question, evidence should be heard in the normal way. And so there was nothing about normal. This trial right now that's going on is happening in the middle of the night. You remember we had the long Passover meal. Jesus taught forever, so I'm in good hands, right? Although, again, Christian does have the record for the longest teaching here right now, the CCF. Just to say that, just to get that out there, I have to remind everyone. I was in good hands. Jesus taught a very long time. Paul taught one time so much that a guy fell out of the window, right, and died. He fell asleep out of the window and then died, and then he resurrected him, came back, and then he taught a few more hours. But nonetheless, I won't do that to you. There's no windows for you to fall out of. But we see here that Jesus was basically saying, listen, you bring the argument, this is how it should happen, but it was at a nighttime trial, an unofficial trial. We'll see the official trial later. But it was this nighttime trial where Annas and Caiaphas are trying to basically get something on Jesus, trying to get him to incriminate himself, and he wouldn't. And Jesus knew it, and so he says, hey, listen, like you got a problem, then ask someone else. Where's your witnesses? There should be plenty of them. I spoke openly. I didn't hide, right? Verses 22 through 24, what happens? And when he said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand. And I think this changed everything, specifically for Peter and John. And I'll tell you why here in a second. Saying, do you answer the high priest like that? Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So, sorry, I think I said he was at Caiaphas. He's at Annas, and then he's going to Caiaphas, and he comes back to Annas later. So this officer struck him. It's anonymous. We don't get his name recorded by God's grace, right? I mean, someone literally striking the Messiah. It's hard to think about, right? But I believe when he struck him, right? He struck him with the palm of his hand. From a distance, we're going to see that Peter and John were probably there. And if you remember last week, we talked about that, where John couldn't get into where Caiaphas was, Peter couldn't, but John knew the family of the high priest. He had some kind of relationship with them, so he was already in. And so then it seems that John went back, vouched for Peter at the girl at the gate and said, let him in. I know him. He's with me. And she asked him and said, are you also one of his disciples? Also, as in, I know John is, but are you also one? And he's like, no. So he denied him there the first time, right? And maybe that was inadvertently. You know, like, oh, he panicked, and he said no. But either way, John's there, Peter's there, and it's most likely, we don't know exactly the scene, but most likely Jesus was probably outside on some kind of porch, and I imagine that John and them were kind of a distance away, but were able to see and still hear all of these things. So imagine you're Peter and you're John, and you've seen Jesus get out of a lot of tough scrapes. You've seen Jesus slip away when people took up rocks to stone him. You've seen, Jesus heal people, raise people back from the dead, all kinds of things, and you thought, okay, just waiting, right? Waiting for Jesus to do his thing, like, all right, any minute now. Any minute, we're going to be here, and he's going to call, some angels down, and I got my sword. John, you got your sword and my slingshot, like, he's going to need us, like, and we're going to come in and, chop some, like Peter already tried to do with the guy's ear. You know what I mean? And so I think there was this sense of, like, Jesus is going to do something. What is it? I want to see it. I want to see what happens. But I think when they saw Jesus get struck that first time, this is the first time the Messiah just ever been just straight up. And the idea, it wasn't like, kind of a slap in the face. The idea in the Greek is that it was with the palm of the hand and more of a boom, like a kind of a jab with the palm of the hand. A cheap shot, if you will. And so I imagine you just seeing your Messiah, your rabbi's head just go back like, oh, what just happened? Like what is going on? Right? Like he's just taking this. He's not doing anything about it. I can imagine just all of a sudden in Peter's heart and in John's, but Peter specifically because he denies him 2 more times, like, oh man, like a little panic. Like I thought this was going to go differently. I thought something else was going to happen. But Jesus just allowed himself to be beaten, allowed himself to be bound, allowed these words to continue to be spoken over him that were false, that were not true. And so Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Annas had nothing on Jesus, so he sent him on to more of official trial, right, to the man who held the high priest office and sent Jesus bound as if he were a dangerous criminal. Look at verses 25 through 27. So what happens? So now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, you are not also one of his disciples, are you? So again, the second time. He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of whose ear Peter cut off, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. So you can kind of see this picture of Peter. The first time he denies Jesus, maybe it was a little inadvertently, like, hey, maybe if I say yes, they're not going to let me in. Like, I don't know, right? I'm just going to give Peter some benefit of the doubt at this point, all right? And so he comes in, and then I think he sees the blow of the Messiah, and he sees the scene happening, and that Jesus is just allowing this to happen, not doing anything to get out of it. And I think there was a little sense now of like, okay, I need to kind of have some self-preservation here. And I think where before maybe it was a lack of faith when he responded no, now here it was a definite, purposeful, I've already done it 2 other times. It's simply just a lack of courage, right? A lack of faith and a lack of courage, that he didn't come and to say, yes, I am a disciple. So Peter denied his actual association with Jesus, right? It wasn't that he just denied some kind of theological truth. And a lot of times, in our circles maybe that we run in, we see people deny God altogether, or if we're a Christian, maybe we deny certain theological truths. Well, I don't believe that Jesus, it was this, or I don't believe this about the Bible, or certain aspects, right? But it was interesting that that Peter actually didn't deny some kind of theological truth about Jesus. He denied his association with Jesus. It's like, no, I do not know him. I don't know him. Leave me alone. So we see this hypocrisy in Peter. And I don't want us ever to be in a place where we deny our association with Jesus. Even if sometimes the media, when they want to interview a Christian, they try to pick the craziest, outlandish, weird person on planet Earth. I'm like, yeah, let's get this guy in front. He's a Christian. And they get up there and say something, and you just cringe at it, and you're like, oh, no, like they're totally misrepresenting Jesus. Like, I wish they would just shut up right now, And so, there's times where I have that. I'm like, man, I don't want to be associated with them. And there may be truth to that, but we have to understand that, hey, there's always a weird person in the family. Always, right? And so God knows the heart, and we should stand up for truth. But also at the same time, never get to a point to where we deny Jesus and our association with him. Ever, right? You notice that this guy that asked him was a relative of whose ear Peter cut off previously. Like, what are the chances? Like, you're just standing here, warming yourself by the fire or whatever, and like, hey, don't I know you? Yeah, I saw you. I was there in the garden, and you cut my cousin's ear off. I remember your face, And Peter's like, no, man, it wasn't me. It was not me. And actually, we see in the original language, it says that when he denied it again, he used words and terms that he actually was cursing and swearing when he said, no, I do not know Jesus. No, I'm not associated with him. And so I think he did that to make it even sound even more like, hey, listen, I'm not a Christian because look at the words I'm using. And look at how I'm doing. Like, okay, yeah, you're definitely not, because a disciple or a follower of Jesus wouldn't use those words, wouldn't act like that. And so he was very forceful. And I think this brings up a side point in Colossians chapter 3, verse 8. I love this verse. It says, but now you must also rid yourself of all such things. These are anger, rage, malice, slander, and I like this one, filthy language from your lips. Filthy language. I love, or obscene talk, your Bible might say. I love this because it does imply, like, obviously a perverted sexual language, right? It does imply that, and that is actually absolutely true. But what I love is that the Bible doesn't say, okay, don't use these words in the English. This word, that word, this word. Okay, and if you're Spanish, don't use these words. Okay, you grew up in this culture, well, don't use these words. It says simply filthy language. And my argument for cursing and all those things, because some people are like, oh, well, they're just words. They're just words, all of these things. Well, that is true, but words actually mean something. They have power behind something. And what gives power behind that is a lot of times the culture, right? The culture actually gives words power in certain ways. And so if a culture is deeming a word in a negative sense, then should it be something, and they deem it as bad, they actually have ratings, based on what words and how many times it's used in a movie. So Hollywood sees that, hey, okay, rated R, the F word's in there more than twice, so then therefore it will be a rated R movie, along with, maybe violence and other things, right? But there is a rating for language, which is interesting to me because they're not even believers, general statement, right? So they're not believers, and they see that certain words are inappropriate for the English language and for movies that will be. But then, I'm going to use the excuse of like, oh, well, that's just, they're just words. if they're deeming it as some kind of filthy language, shouldn't that be something that we put out of our mouth? I think so. And will that change from culture to culture? Yeah. You may go to some other language and you had no idea, and you use a word and you're like, someone's super offended, you're like, oh, I don't know, that's just what I read in my dictionary for, translation. But then they explain to you, right? And so there will be that, especially here in St. Kitts, I find that to be true. Because there can be words here in St. Kitts that they would use that, may in America, like the S word, is really not a curse word here. But in the States, like that would be offensive, so forth, so on. And so I get that. But I just wanted to have that little side note that it's just filthy language in general, right? And so if the world is saying something is in a negative context, then so should we. And could that change over time? Absolutely. I remember, and I hope this doesn't offend anybody when I say this, but I remember when I was young and I would say, oh, this sucks, right? My dad would be furious. And maybe you grew up with that type of mentality. And for me, I was like, why? Like, I'm just saying this stinks. Like, this is a bad thing. Like, bummer. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that was my intent. And my dad was like, well, when I was growing up, that had a totally different derogatory sexual meaning. And so whenever I said that, like, that's what he heard. I'm like, oh. And I think there could be an argument made that word has now started to transition from not that derogatory meaning, but to just this stinks. This is just a bummer. That's just my opinion, but it's just hopefully an idea that you understand that words can change to where it was offensive then, or it's not now, or it wasn't then and now it is, right? So just for you to understand that, side note, Colossians 3:8, study it, read it. Let's put filthy language out of our mouth so we can be a witness for Jesus and not a hypocrite. So, and then immediately the rooster crowed. Verse 28, Jesus is brought before Pilate now. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. And again, like the hypocrisy is truly amazing in my opinion as I look at this, right? So they have the interrogation with Annas, then he's sent to Caiaphas, right? And then now, okay, we can't get anything concrete on him. Let's send him to Pilate. We really want him to die. That's our end goal, is to kill him. So maybe Pilate will, do this for us, even though we don't really have too much to say negative about this man besides the fact that we just hate him, right? So they take him to this headquarters. They take him to Pilate. They themselves did not go in. And this exposes the huge hypocrisy of the Jewish rulers, right? They refused to break such a small thing so they could eat some kind of meal. But they have no problem about the hatred in their hearts and trying to kill an innocent man, murder him. It's like murder, check, we're okay with that. But I can't go into an actual building because then I'll defile myself and won't actually be able to eat this bread, right? Like, are you kidding me? Like, how do you not get this? And this is Jesus' own words, Matthew chapter 23, about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You ready for this? Chapter 23, verses 23 through 28. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You pay tithes of mint, dill, and cumin, but you have disregarded the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. So they had tithes and certain offerings that would be presented, and they did that. But when it came to actually practice and giving justice and mercy and faithfulness, they didn't practice that. Verse 24, you blind guides, I love this. You strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. That just makes me laugh. If I was there, I think I would have laughed at that joke from Jesus, right? Like, only it wasn't a joke. But like a gnat and you're swallowing a camel, like someone eating a camel. That's funny. Nonetheless, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and selfish indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and the dish, so that the outside may become clean as well. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead man's bones and every impurity. In the same way, on the outside you appear to be righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Ouch! It's like, oh man, so they were so concerned about all the outside, they actually missed the inside. They're so concerned about, we want to get rid of Jesus, we will lie, we will bribe, we will commit murder, but I won't go into that building so I can eat this meal later. You know, it's just like, oh man, how blind and full of hate do you have to be at that point? And full of sin. And you know what? If we have to take a look at our hearts, we could say maybe we've been there at some point, or maybe you are struggling in certain ways. And this isn't a discouraging message, but hopefully one that, yes, brings conviction to say, I'm doing this and I shouldn't be. I'm sinning and I shouldn't be. I'm coming here and playing this part, but I'm actually not living like Christ wants me to live. That's good. I want you to be convicted. But I don't want you to walk out of the room and think, oh, this is a message of doom and gloom. It's a message of, hey, you're convicted. This is the perfect place to do something about it, right? To repent, to get prayer, to say, Lord, forgive me. Mercy and grace is totally available. But remember that it's not condemnation. It's conviction that God brings across and a point to our lives. So, verse 29 through 32, here he is before Pilate. Then they went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? So Pilate's like, okay, I gave you the troops because it was a detachment of Roman troops last week, remember? Possibly into the hundreds. The word used there is hundreds. So it was John being metaphorical, we don't know, but we know there was a troop of Roman detachments, a detachment of Roman troops, and we also know there was a group of religious leaders and temple security, if we could call them that were also there arresting Jesus. So possibly hundreds of people. So we know Pilate knew about this because there's no way there would be a detachment of Roman troops to go arrest someone without his authority, without him knowing about it, right? So he knows this. So he's saying, listen, okay, you brought him. Tell me, what am I trying him for? What's he doing? What's their response? He says, they answered and said to him, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. So they don't even answer the question. Then Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. But this saying, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Because he was supposed to die crucifixion. And crucifixion was not a Jewish way of dying. It was a Roman way of dying. If he was going to be killed by the Jews, they would have what? Most likely stoned him. But because it was prophesied, you know, we see it in Psalm, Isaiah, and then Jesus himself, this had to be fulfilled right here. So they're trying to, you know, carry it over, give it to the Romans so that they will actually kill them. And so I just love this kind of banter back and forth. He says, hey, what accusation do you have? Let me see. You know, this is Roman law. You know, where's the accusers? All this. Oh, well, just trust us. He's an evildoer, or why would we have brought him to you? You know, kind of thing. Like, and Pilate's like, I can't write that down. You know what I mean? Like, I can't give that to Caesar account. Like, oh, they said he was evil, so I killed him. There actually is some kind of formal system here in Rome. And so I need to actually be able to say that this is what happened. And so Pilate says, hey, listen, like obviously you have a problem. Pilate was a smart man. Obviously you have a problem with him. And obviously you can't find anything wrong with him. And so, hey, you go judge him according to your own law. Go do your thing. I'll let it happen. But then the real motivation comes out of why they're bringing him to Pilate. We can't kill him, but you can. You have taken away our right under Roman rule to give capital punishment. So they're basically saying, listen, the whole reason we are not dealing with it ourselves is because we want him dead. Well, what did he do? It doesn't matter. He's evil. We want him dead. Or else they could have judged the matter. They could have shunned him. They could have, flogged him. They could have done certain things that would have been allowed and overlooked by the Roman government except for death. And this just shows up their heart. They just want him dead. They're not going to defile themselves inside this house, but they'll absolutely commit murder or conspiracy and accomplices to do so. John doesn't record this, but eventually the religious leader did give more specific answers to Pilate's demand. And they said in Luke chapter 23, verse 2, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, seeing that he himself was a Christ and a king. And it's kind of like, you see what they did there, right? Like we know Jesus said, give unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. But we also know that Jesus was saying that he was the king of the Jews and that he was the Messiah, right? Especially towards the end of his ministry. So they tried to pervert it and word it in such a way that it would offend Rome. Because that's what they had to do. They had to find a way to offend Rome and break Roman law so that then Rome would crucify him and take care of him. And so they lied and made those things up, mixed in with other truths, right, that we see. Verses 33 through 35. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" Jesus was so wise. Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Well, first off, we know that Jesus was the king of the Jews. And we know that Pilate knew something about this because he had sent the detachment out, as we already said. But Pilate's looking at him as like, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Almost in a mockery. Like, I'm looking at you like, you're this king? Like, I've seen other rebellious people. I've seen, insurrections come up, and I've had to deal with them. And I've seen their leaders and their ripped muscles and, whatever, like their coolness, right? You, this lowly Jew from Nazareth, like, are a king. Almost kind of mocking him, right? Like, how does this work? So he expected to see this great man, but he didn't. And then Jesus asked this question, great man in his mindset, I should say. He says, "Are you speaking for yourself?" Jesus really wanted to know if Pilate really wanted to know if he had asked the question on behalf of those who had already condemned Jesus. Is this what they've told you to ask me to try to get me to trip me up? So then I would be incriminating myself against you, right? Is this what they said? Because it's twofold, right? If he asked the question and meant like, "Hey, are you a political king? And are you here to overthrow Rome and conspiring against Caesar in some rebellious way? Are you that king?" Jesus could have answered and said, "No, I am not." Right? But if he's asking the questions, "Hey, are you the Messiah? Are you the Savior? Are you the Messianic king of Israel?" Then the answer would have been yes. So it's like, "Pilate, what are you asking?" And he knew. "You're trying to trip me up to say yes, that I'm a king, and you're going to take it as I mean I'm a political king. Now you have a reason to crucify me. But the reality is that I am a king, but not how you think. Not how you think." And to prove it, you go down and you look and see what he says. Look at verse 36, excuse me. "And Jesus answered, 'My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here.'" So Jesus is clarifying, listen, I have a heavenly kingdom, and it's a spiritual kingdom. And it's mightier than Rome. It goes beyond your legions and your swords and your power, because Rome thought that's what power was. Is my navy, my fist, my iron, the chariots. Right? And that's how they measure the strength of their kingdom. But Jesus was saying, listen, my kingdom is not of this world. And it's mightier than your kingdom. And so Jesus is saying, hey, this is something spiritual, not something necessarily physical like you're thinking, Pilate. I'm not here to overthrow Rome because my kingdom is in heaven. Right? How does Pilate respond? Verse 37 and 38. "Pilate therefore said to him, 'Are you a king then?' And Jesus answered, 'You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And everyone who is of the truth hears my voice.' Pilate said to him, 'What is truth?' And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews, and he said to them, 'I find no fault in him at all.'" This was the statement that interested Pilate. "Are you a king then?" So what are you telling me? Your kingdom's not of this world? Like, what do you mean? Are you a king or are you not a king? And Jesus says, listen, this is why I was born. This is why I came into this world. But it's for a spiritual kingdom, not in what you are thinking. And so I think at this point, Pilate gets it. He's just like, okay, this dude is a little crazy. He's got his own gods. I got my Roman gods. He is just saying, that he is some kind of Messiah, and that's for their gods. That's for them, right? So Pilate totally understood what he was saying, that he was not a king that was any threat to Rome, and that's why he came out and he said, I find no fault in him at all. But there's an interesting thing that happens here, is in the midst of it, he says, what is truth? Right? What is truth? And this is, I think, a question a lot of the world asks today. And I think, honestly, in context, Pilate was asking in truth in a spiritual sense. I think Pilate believed in absolute truth, but I think he was just asking in a sense, oh, so you're telling me you're a god from another kingdom, or you're this Messiah? Oh, I have lots of gods. You know, we have lots of gods over here, Zeus and all these guys, right? I have lots of guys, a Greek god, but the Roman version, right? I have all these gods. So, man, like, what is truth when it comes to religion? What is truth when it comes to all that stuff? You're spiritual, you're not. Like, we have lots of gods. But there is a sense where a lot of people ask this question, and they mean it in a subjective or objective way, right? So people will say there's no such thing as absolute truth. And maybe you've heard that before. So what you believe is true, and that's good for you. And what I believe is true, that's what is good for me. The problem is, as soon as you say there's no such thing as absolute truth, that statement is an absolute truth statement. You follow me? There is no absolute truth. Is that true? Well, if you're saying it's true, then that is an absolute truth. And then everything else would be, there would have to be other absolute truths. So it's a contradictory statement. So there has to be truths that are absolute. Then it's just the questions of which one. Well, it's just like sometimes we think of God and we think of the arguments for God, against God, the Bible, and we think of subjective or objective, right? Objective is like, okay, it's proven, I can have evidence, and I can have things, I can see it, right? To touch it, feel it, those kind of things. There's proof to it. Subjective is more opinionated, right? I think peanut butter ice cream is the best. That's a subjective statement. You could argue of why you think chocolate or vanilla is the best, and we could go round and round and really not get anywhere except for you prefer that and I prefer this. You understand? But we take that now, and with a broad brush, we paint everything. The world just paints everything with that. Well, it's just like ice cream. No, it's not. There are things that are absolutely, positively objective. If I cut your head off, you will die. Well, I don't know. Well, let's try. No, just kidding. Like, I mean, there's certain things that you guys know. You're smart people. A lot of you are going to be doctors. There are certain things that are absolutely objective. If you do this, this will be the result. It's all through science, and that's part of what science is. But then yet, when it comes to other things, we try to say, well, no, that's not true, right? It's subjective, all of this. Philosophy and religion and all these things. And I get it. There are certain points that there will be. But there is such thing as absolute truth, and that's what we need to understand. That's what we need to know. You know, one of my favorite, arguments in talking about, the Big Bang and all of those things, I'm not going to get into that, but one argument that I love is when, we talk about, as soon as someone says, well, there was a Big Bang. Well, if there was nothing, or even if there was some particles or whatever, and then it came together, and there's this Big Bang, it's like, where did these other particles and other things, come from? Right? But then anything that has, a beginning, right? Anything that has a cause has a beginning, right? And so since something caused it, and you're telling me that these things came together, then, okay, there was a beginning. So something that started that would have to actually exist out of a beginning. That's exactly what God is. God exists outside of time. He exists outside of nothing. He exists outside of all matter. Matter only does, in my opinion, what it was designed to do. So whether you want to believe in evolution, you don't, or whatever, at the end of the day, the cells and matter will only do what it is designed to do. Period, right? So something had to be outside of that to then cause this, and whatever else you want to believe after that. And we can debate that, and that's fun to do. But there has to be an absolute that exists outside of that. I have this little excerpt from this book that I want to read before we close up. And it's called, it's from Cold Case Christianity. And I encourage you to get this book. And it's a long excerpt, but it proves my point kind of here of that there is such thing as absolute truth, and we can know it. We may not understand everything, and we may not grasp everything, but we don't have to know everything. If I have a puzzle, okay, and it's a 100-piece puzzle, how many pieces of the puzzle do you need to know that it's a picture of two cats playing with a ball of yarn? I mean, how many pieces can you still be missing and being like, it's still absolutely, I may not know the color of the cat's eyes, I'm missing a leg, but I know it's a cat, I can see the ball of yarn, I only got half of it. You could be missing several pieces and still, with absolute certainty, say what? It's a puzzle with two cats playing with a ball of yarn. I can't answer all the questions because I'm missing the eye and I'm missing certain things. But this is absolutely true, right? I think it's very, very easy for us to understand. So, I want to pick this up here. Give me 1 second. I had it marked and now it's not. Okay. Can the truth be proved beyond a reasonable doubt when all the evidence we have is circumstantial? Absolutely, he says. Jurors are instructed to make no qualitative distinction between direct and circumstantial evidence in a case. Bear with me, it's going to be kind of heady, but he explains it. Judges tell jurors both direct and circumstantial evidence are acceptable types of evidence to prove or disprove the elements of charge, including intent and mental state and acts necessary to a conviction. So basically, imagine yourself, you're a juror on trial, and you're looking at the evidence for someone that has committed this murder. So he gives us a hypothetical situation. He says, let's examine a murder to demonstrate the power of direct and circumstantial evidence. I want you to put yourself on the jury as the following case is being presented in court. First, let's lay out the elements of the crime. On a sunny afternoon in a quiet residential neighborhood, the calm was broken by the sound of screaming, sorry if this disturbs anyone, coming from a house on the corner. The scream was very short and was heard by a neighbor who was watering her lawn next door. The witness peered through the large picture window of the corner house and observed a man assaulting her neighbor in the living room. The man was viciously bludgeoning the victim with a baseball bat. The witness next saw the suspect open the front door of the house and run from the residence with the bloody bat in hand. She got a long look at his face as he ran to the car parked directly in front of the victim's residence. If the witness was now sitting on the witness stand testifying that the defendant in our case was in fact the man she saw murdering the victim, she would be providing us with a piece of direct evidence. If we came to trust that the witness had to say that this one piece of direct evidence would be enough to prove that the defendant had committed a murder. But what if things had been a little bit different? So you kind of think the evidence for God. Like, no one has seen God. I can't pull him out of my pocket. I don't have this direct evidence of like, boom, here he is. Oh, you can pet him. He's really cool. He's shiny. I don't have this specific direct evidence. So he takes it a little bit different and said, let's take of some circumstantial evidence. Can we still have the truth? He says, what if our suspect in this case had been wearing a mask when he committed the murder? If this were the case, our witness would be unable to identify the killer directly or facially and would be able to provide us with scant information. She could tell us about the killer's general build and what kind of clothing he was wearing, but very little more. With the information alone, would it be possible to prove that any particular defendant was the true killer? So you have an eyewitness, they see it happen and can see certain features, but there's a mask. We're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Could you as a juror, say on that person's testimony, like, well, it fits the right build, the right height, and I saw his hands, it's the right skin color, and that's all you had? Would you be able to convict them and be like, a jail, rest of your life? Probably not. I think we would all say no. Okay, but now let's say the detectives developed a potential suspect. His name was Ron Jacobson. Anybody in here named Ron Jacobson? Okay, just making sure. And begun to collect information about this activity at the time of the murder. When the detectives questioned Ron, he hesitated to provide them with an alibi. And when he finally did offer a story, detectives investigated it and determined that it was a lie. On the basis of this lie, do you think Ron is guilty of this murder? Probably not. I don't think we could all still say, like, it was absolutely him. We would be on the jury and be like, yeah, he's lying. Yeah, he's shady. But we don't have just enough evidence to say this is absolutely him. I don't know if I could say, yes, kill him, give him the death penalty, or put him away for life. Right? That'd be very difficult. All right, go a little further. We now have two pieces of circumstantial evidence that point to Ron as the killer. But without something more, few of us would be willing to convict him. Let's see what else the detectives were able to discover. During the interview with Ron, they learned that he had recently broken up with the victim after a tumultuous romantic relationship. He admitted to arguing with her recently about the relationship and was extremely nervous whenever the detectives focused on her. He repeatedly tried to minimize his relationship with her. Are you any closer to returning a verdict on Ron now? Maybe. Some of you may still be like, I don't have absolute proof. And others may be like, I'm pretty sure he did it. But would be pretty sure be enough for you to condemn a man for the rest of his life. He fits the general description. He lied about it, his alibi, and he has been suspiciously nervous and evasive in the interview. It's not looking good for Ron. But there may be other reasonable explanations for what we've seen so far, right? Even though we have three pieces of circumstantial evidence that point to Ron's involvement in this crime, there still isn't enough to be absolutely certain of his guilt. But what if I told you that responding officers found that the suspect, in this case, entered the victim's residence and appeared to be waiting for her when she returned home? And I'll kind of skip a little bit. You find out that there's only 2 people with keys, and one of them was Ron. Okay, I'm getting a little bit closer. I still didn't see his face. We still don't have any physical evidence tying him to it. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to say, this seems to be pretty true, right? But what if you learned that the investigators also were approached by a friend of Ron's who found a suicide note? The suicide note outlines all of this, just going through it, basically how he wanted to kill himself because he can't live without her, and if, he can't have her, then no one kind of can. Okay, right? Some of you are probably willing to give a guilty verdict, right, at this point. Some of you may still be like, well, maybe he was just super depressed. I remember when that girl broke up with me, I was really depressed and it was crazy, Okay, maybe so. So it's accumulating, right? It's getting bigger and bigger. But let's just say they get now something to search the house. They get a warrant to search the house. First, they discover a baseball bat hidden under Ron's bed. The bat was dented and damaged in a way that was inconsistent with his use as a baseball bat. But the lab did chemical tests. There's no blood on it, but did find that it was recently cleaned with bleach. Again, I don't have any physical evidence tying, but that's pretty shady, right? Pretty shady. So all of these things eventually adding up, right? And then what happens if there was a specific boot that the person saw, like, hey, I remember these boots that he was wearing. They were very specific. I've seen this in the store because they're very unique. And guess what? Detectives recovered this pair of boots from Ron's house. And it's the same boots that Ron described. So what do? They look and find a store that has sold them, right? And there's only been 12 boots ever sold from that store. And Ron happens to own a pair of them, right? And then what happens if the victim also saw the car, and the car drove away, and Ron just happens to have the same make and model and year of that car that she said she saw, right? There's no physical specific evidence, maybe the car, bat, but there's no blood, there's none of that, right? But yet we, I think, as a jury would be able to concretely say, I have enough of the puzzle pieces to say, without a doubt, Ron is the killer. Even though we found no knife, we found no blood, nothing, right? I think we could all probably be in pretty much agreement on that. And so, what does that have to do with all this? Well, as we close, because I know we're over the time, I want you to understand that truth is not relative, that truth can be known. Truth can be searched out. There will be certain things that are preferences and opinions. But there are certain things that are absolutes in this world. And God is one of them. And I believe as you study the Scripture and you study Jesus, you study the Word of God, you will find out that the argument to say that, you have your truth about Jesus and I have my truth about Jesus is a very faulty one. And doesn't stand on too much ground at all. And even a secular system of a court would agree and say, listen, let's look and examine evidence. And even if it's circumstantial, even if I have nothing direct, I could still come back and deliver a pretty good verdict on just circumstantial evidence with only certain pieces of the puzzle. So what happens? Pilate finds no fault on him. Verses 39 through 40. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release you, the king of the Jews? And they all cried out saying, no, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. The crowd rejected Jesus and chose Barabbas instead. Pilate hoped they would spare Jesus, but the crowd condemned him. They already wanted him to die, right? And this was obviously part of God's plan. And without it, obviously, we wouldn't have forgiveness. But no one can understand Jesus dying in your place. Like we say that kind of metaphorically, but truthfully. But Jesus was 2,000 years ago. But Barabbas was actually the actual physical person that was supposed to be on that cross. And Jesus actually took his place, literally, on the cross. It'd be interesting to see whatever happened to Barabbas. If I had to put money on it, I bet you Barabbas became a believer. Don't know for sure. Again, when we get our movie theaters in heaven and you'll see me there just watching, the life of Paul and stuff, that'll be one tape that I have is Barabbas. Oh, what happened to Barabbas? And we'll see if I'm right. But nonetheless, Jesus died in our place, also very literally. That if we believe in Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, he took the punishment for our sin upon him.